This morning we're looking at Martha of Bethany, and I'm going to ask Jill to do the readings from John's Gospel. I'm going strenuously to avoid the reading from Luke's Gospel, because we want to look at Martha as a different sort of person to the person which I think Luke portrays. So Jill, if you would, from John 11 and then from John 12.
Yes, I'm doing John 11. I think someone else is doing John 12.
Okay, well, that'll come straight after. So whoever.
Pat.
First one, and then picking up at 17. Now, a certain man was ill, Lazarus of Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. When Jesus arrived, he found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb 4 days. Now, Bethany was near Jerusalem, some 2 miles away, and many of the Jews had come to Martha and Mary to console them about their brother. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went and met him, while Mary stayed at home. Martha said to Jesus, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But even now I know that God will give you whatever you ask of him." Jesus said to her, "Your brother will rise again." Martha said to him, "I know that he will rise again in the resurrection on the last day." Jesus said to her, "I am the resurrection and the life. Those who believe in me, even though they die, will live. And everyone who lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this?" She said to him, "Yes, Lord. I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, the one coming into the world." When she had said this, she went back and called her sister Mary and told her privately, "The teacher is here and is calling for you." And when she heard it, she got up quickly and went to him. Now Jesus had not yet come to the village, but was still at the place where Martha had met him. The Jews who were with her in the house, consoling her, saw Mary get up quickly and go out. They followed her, because they thought that she was going to the tomb to weep there. When Mary came where Jesus was and saw him, she knelt at his feet and said to him, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who came with her also weeping, he was greatly disturbed in spirit and deeply moved. He said, "Where have you laid him?" They said to him, "Lord, come and see." Jesus began to weep. So the Jews said, "See how he loved him." But some of them said, "Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind have kept this man from dying?" Then Jesus, again greatly disturbed, came to the tomb. It was a cave, and a stone was lying against it. Jesus said, "Take away the stone." Martha, the sister of the dead man, said to him, "Lord, already there is a stench, because he has been dead 4 days." Jesus said to her, "Did I not tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God?" So they took away the stone. And Jesus looked upwards and said, "Father, I thank you for having heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I've said this for the sake of the crowd standing here, so that they may believe that you sent me." When he had said this, he cried with a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out." The dead man came out, his hands and feet bound with strips of cloth, and his face wrapped in a cloth. Jesus said to them, "Unbind him and let him go."
And now, if Pat would like to read John 12, verses 1 to 3.
1 to 3, right. 6 days before the Passover celebration began, Jesus arrived in Bethany, the home of Lazarus, the man Jesus had raised from the dead. A dinner was prepared in Jesus' honor, and Martha served, and Lazarus was among those who ate with him. Then Mary took a 12-ounce jar of expensive perfume made from the essence of nard, and she anointed Jesus' feet with it, wiping his feet with her hair. And the house was filled with the fragrance.
Thank you very much. Oh, sorry. Sorry, Tim. We're all grateful to both of you for reading. Thank you so much. Well, let's start off by thinking about Bethany. I think in the first Bible study we had, I indicated that the 4 women we're considering, Mary of Nazareth, Photine of Sychar, Martha of Bethany, and Mary of Magdala all came from quite widely spread places, but they were strong women. And so let's have a look at Bethany, where Bethany may be. Today, Bethany is called Al-Azariah. It means the place of Lazarus, not the place of Mary and Martha, as scripture tells us. It's a Palestinian enclave. It's surrounded by the Israeli West Bank barrier to the north, the east, and the west. And it borders the town of Abu Dis on the south. And that particular enclave continues on to Bethlehem. So it's an area which today, and I suppose as we listen to the news at these times, we will recognize that it is a very uneasy place where there is a great deal of civil unrest. It's less than 2 miles from Jerusalem, about a 40 minutes walk or so. And since 2005, it has actually been cut off from Jerusalem by this separation wall. And the separation wall, in fact, cuts across the main street of Bethany, making a serious impact, as you can imagine, on the lives of the residents and, of course, on the town's economy. So that's where the inhabitants of Bethany are today. It's quite near the village of Bethphage, of which we also hear in scripture, which is associated with the incident where Jesus' disciples commandeered, I think that's the only word we can use, commandeered a donkey on the first Palm Sunday, which is something that's recorded by the 3 synoptic gospel writers, but not by John. And it is, of course, only in Matthew's gospel that Bethphage is actually definitively located, because the others simply say they found a donkey. But there you go. The more familiar story we have about Martha is, of course, the Lucan story, where Martha and Mary are entertaining Jesus and his disciples. Martha is working hard, as you can well imagine, having 13 young men lined up on her doorstep, and Mary is sitting at Jesus' feet. Martha is, like Queen Victoria, not amused. I was preaching on this in Ballineen, a small village in West Cork, during the summer. And before the readings and so on, there's usually a children's slot. And the children in this particular church are very interactive, shall we say. And I brightly said to them, what would Mummy do if she opened the door and found 13 hungry young men standing there? And this little mite chipped up just like that. She'd have a barbecue. So there you go. I don't think I'll ever forget him. But that's the story of Martha, the more familiar story of Martha. Martha, the fuss pot, preparing food for a crowd, complaining that Mary is doing nothing but sitting at Jesus' feet. And this, of course, is the scene that is celebrated in art. Stephen, can you put up some of the pictures that I found? You may find them interesting. It doesn't matter what order they come in. This one you may recognize the light on the left, which is the one I showed you last week of Jesus with the woman at the well in Samaria. Now, the other light in that window is Jesus with Mary and Martha. And there are a number of interesting things about this picture, which is in the Church of Ireland in a small town in West Cork. Jesus has his back to himself, you may notice. So is this saying something about reaching in all directions with the gospel? Fotine in the light on the left is dressed quite differently to Mary and Martha in the light on the right. But of course, she was a Samaritan and they were Hebrews. And you see that Martha is holding a plate with bread on it. And on the table behind Jesus is a flagon. So is it prefiguring the bread and the wine of Holy Communion? It's a lovely window. And the really interesting thing about it is that this window was created in the late 1860s and is dedicated to a man. So I'd love to know the story of why a window dedicated to a leading man in the congregation actually has the story of women in it. I think that's interesting. Next, Stephen, if you would. Now, this is an interesting one. This is by Velázquez, and this can be found in the National Gallery of Scotland. And you see that Velázquez has the story of Mary and Martha up there in the right-hand corner. You can see Martha is haranguing somewhat, and Jesus has his hand out saying, "Let us stay." But in the foreground are this elderly housekeeper and a rather sullen-looking maid with fish, garlic, and eggs on the table. Fish, of course, is a symbol of Christianity. The egg is a symbol of new birth, bursting forth. And there is something about garlic, and someone will have to remind you. But that is a lovely picture. Its sister picture, which is Jesus at Emmaus, can be found in the National Gallery of Ireland, and you'll just have to come and see it. And the next one may be more familiar to you. This is the Vermeer picture of, and this is also in the National Gallery of Scotland, of Jesus with Mary and Martha. And you can see again that Martha has a basket with bread in it, and all that bread symbolizes. But this is the picture. These are the pictures that we're most familiar with. It's the story with which we're most familiar. And we know, thank you, Stephen, we know that this was a family of siblings who were much loved by Jesus, whether they were related to him or whatever. Linguists will indicate to you that Martha, the name Martha, is a Latin version of a Greek name, and the Greek name in itself is a translation from Aramaic. So follow that one, you linguists. And it means mistress. So are we to suppose that Martha was the elder sister? It's usually supposed she was, but in some places in John's Gospel, for example, it refers to Bethany as the village of Mary and her sister Martha. So we don't know. The story we read in the second reading that Pat read for us is John's account of a dinner in honor of Jesus, which comes after the raising of Lazarus and the furore that took place after that. And there Martha is specifically mentioned as serving. But commentators will tell us that the particular verb that is used in some of these instances is a verb which indicates that she was the hostess. She was the one in charge, rather than the person who was actually picking up and doing the washing up and the cooking and so on. But to return to the longer reading, which Jill shared with us, here we have another conversation between Jesus and a woman. We have that very brief conversation that he has, very brief indeed, between Jesus and his mother at the wedding feast in Cana of Galilee. We have the longest conversation recorded between Jesus and anyone in the story in John chapter 4, the story of Photine at the well in Samaria. And here now is another quite lengthy conversation between Jesus and a woman. And this time, Martha, someone he knows and loves well. Not a mother, not a stranger, but a friend. Someone with whom and with whose family he was intimate. It's interesting that in Luke's gospel, Jesus refers to her twice, Martha, Martha. Not so here, but the commentators will tell you that when a name, I was going to say a Christian name, but of course it's not in the Old Testament, a forename is used twice. It's a sign of divine encounter, and it's used for emphasis. God calls Abraham, Abraham, Abraham. Similarly in Exodus, Moses, Moses. And then when Saul is riding to Damascus to do away with the Christians, as he has his conversion experience, he hears God, Christ, calling him, Saul, Saul. So Martha, in the context of all the Bible passages, is someone who encounters God in a very special way. Another very interesting thing about this particular passage we've been reading is Martha's confession of who Jesus is. Jesus says to her, I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me will live even though he dies, and whoever lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this? She says, yes, I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God, who was to come into the world. Now, in the three synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, it is Peter that makes that confession. Peter, who acknowledges that the young man he's been walking around Galilee and is now tramping up to Jerusalem with, Peter acknowledges that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. In John's Gospel, it's Martha who makes this confession. And indeed, some people have referred to her as the female Peter. And there are lots of parallels you might like to draw there. She's impetuous. She doesn't mind speaking her mind, even though it may not be popular. And we notice that both sisters say to Jesus, if you'd only been here, Lazarus wouldn't have died. And Martha, of course, in the Lucan account, tells Jesus, tell her to get up and do a bit of work. So there are many respects in which Martha is not unlike Peter, and particularly like Peter in her recognition that the person to whom she is speaking is the Son of God, the one who was to come into the world. John's Gospel makes the point that there are a number of signs of Jesus' ministry among people. And the wedding feast at the Cana of Galilee was the first of these signs, when the water was turned into wine. Here, the raising of Lazarus is the final sign in John's Gospel of Jesus' ministry, of Jesus' presence among God's people before the resurrection, which of course is the ultimate sign of God among God's people. Another parallel, I think, with the wedding feast at Cana is that this is a plea for help in a hopeless situation. The wine had run out, a really nasty matter for a host at a wedding banquet. What can you do about it? And here, this is a plea for help from two women, but particularly from Martha, for their brother. Now, you could say that Martha's faith is fairly rudimentary, but nevertheless, she is listening to Jesus, she hears Jesus, and like Fotine, her faith is open to development. Her faith develops in dialogue with Jesus. And she is not afraid to engage with him, to question, to ask. And like Fotine, when she's finished the conversation, notice that she goes back to offer comfort and support to her equally bereft sister Mary, who has stayed at home and only comes out when she hears that Jesus is asking for her. As Fotine returns to her town, to Sychar, to tell the people, come and see this guy that I've met. So Martha returns in a way to say exactly the same thing. Jesus is here and he's looking for you. They go to tell. And that is really important. I think what is interesting as we read the stories in the Gospels of this family, and particularly, of course, in John's Gospel, what happened next? We don't know. Neither Mary, Martha, nor Lazarus is mentioned again by name in either the Gospel or Acts. They are not named as being at the cross or the tomb, and neither are they evident in the Acts of the Apostles after the resurrection. What happened? Well, there is the question, if you look in John chapter 12 at verses 9 through 11, a large crowd of Jews found out that Jesus was there and came not only because of him, but also to see Lazarus, whom he had raised from the dead. So the chief priests made plans to kill Lazarus as well, For on account of him, many Jews were going over to Jesus and putting their faith in him. Let's get rid of him. So did they flee? Did the Bethany family have to leave their village and go elsewhere because of this very real threat on the life of their brother? The Orthodox tradition relates that Lazarus was cast out of Jerusalem at the time of the persecution against the Jerusalem church following the martyrdom of Stephen, which wasn't all that much later, of course. They say too that Martha fled to Judea with him, and assisted him in proclaiming the gospel in various places. Though in the Orthodox tradition and in other traditions, the position of Mary in this is rather less clear, because particularly the Western Church, but not only the Western Church, has very often conflated Mary of Bethany with Mary of Magdala. So it's rather more confused. And it's interesting to note that Martha is the one person in the Bethany family who is most prominently recognized in the liturgical calendars of the churches. And by the churches, I include the Roman tradition, the Orthodox tradition with ourselves. She figures in the commemorations of Lazarus Sunday. And Lazarus Sunday, for your edification, is the Sunday before Palm Sunday. She's venerated as a saint in the Roman Catholic Church and in the Orthodox Church, and she's commemorated by our Lutheran and Anglican sisters and brothers on July the 29th. So you can look out for July the 29th. In the Eastern Orthodox tradition, Mary and Martha were among the group which are referred to as the myrrh-bearing women, myrrh-carrying women, who came to Jesus' tomb early in the morning following the Sabbath with myrrh, an expensive oil, as you know, and one of the gifts which signaled the birth of Jesus, as the wise persons from the East brought gold and frankincense and myrrh. And so Mary and Martha are among the people who might be commemorated on the Sunday of the myrrh bearers, and that is the second Sunday after Easter Sunday. So I think in reflecting on these women in John's Gospel, you're getting a whole new look to your liturgical calendar. But it is interesting because so often we forget these things. And further to all this, the Eastern Orthodox tradition and the Byzantine rite of the Eastern Catholic churches, they commemorate Martha and Mary on June the 4th. So you have quite a choice there, sisters and brothers. Just take your pick. It's further interesting that through time, as reverence for Martha developed, the images of strength and maturity and common sense and care for others have predominated. Someone has written a little poem that goes like this, and if anyone knows who wrote it, please put something in the chat box. Lord of all pots and pans and things, since I've no time to be a saint by doing lovely things, or watching late with thee, or dreaming in the dawnlight, or storming heaven's gates, make me a saint by getting meals and washing up the plates. I'm sure there are a lot of us who feel a little like that. So here is a woman who knows with a degree of intimacy the person to whom she is speaking. Here is a woman who is wrestling with the things of the faith in very challenging circumstances. And here is a woman who finally finds herself in a position to affirm that faith. There are three things there that we need to take on board for our own life of discipleship. Some of us are more aware of this than others of us. Someone who knows to whom she's speaking. How well have we come to know Jesus Christ? Someone who wrestles with the things of the faith at difficult times for them. And some of us, maybe all of us, have done that at challenging times. Have we wrestled with the faith when things have been challenging? And she's someone who, thirdly, is in a position, finally, having come through the struggle, in the light of her knowledge of who it is to whom she's speaking, who is able to affirm that faith. You are the Christ. And as I said, here is a woman who's doing that most difficult of things, maintaining and affirming her faith at a time of personal darkness and grief. Because when she says that, Jesus has not done doesn't achieve the raising of Lazarus. Indeed, Martha very shortly after will say, well, don't be opening that tomb. He's been dead for 4 days. And here, too, is a woman who in so many ways, materially, emotionally, and spiritually, has thought for those around her. She provides for others. She cares for her sister. And she relates to her God. I know that he will rise again. That's her brother. I know that he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day. To which Jesus replies, I am the resurrection and the life. And Martha says, I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God, who was to come into the world. And we read those passages from John's Gospel about Martha, and not the Lucan ones, though we've referred to that passage. But we need to remind ourselves constantly that in the Martha of Luke's Gospel and the Martha of John's Gospel are one and the same person. They are the same woman. And we need, I think, and I hope we will a little later, reflect on how that works out in our own lives. Am I Luke's Martha, whether I'm a woman or not? Am I John's Martha? And the likely answer is a little bit of both.